Welcome to This Constitution. My name is Savannah Eccles Johnston.
And I'm Matthew Brogdon.
And today we're going to talk about treaties, and in particular, why the Senate is involved in treaties. And this was a debate, even at the Constitutional Convention. This wasn't like a foregone conclusion. So why? Why involve the treaties, or why involve the Senate in the treaty-making process?
Yeah, it's funny that you ask it that way, because some people would ask, why is this an executive power? If treaties are law, why is the president doing it? But that does seem to be the terms of debate at the Constitutional Convention is, can the president do this by himself? Can the Senate do it by itself? There's a proposal for that, most famously from Charles Pinckney, says, no, the Senate should do this. The Senate should negotiate treaties and make them. It will be the sort of diplomatic branch of the legislature. The position that the framers go with is to have the president, in the terms of the Constitution, the president, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, shall make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. So that's the rule we land on. And it seems to put the president in the driver's seat in terms of diplomacy and negotiating with foreign countries.
Right, but we still don't really know what this looks like in practice. What's interesting, this is kind of a Hamiltonian win, right? This is Hamilton saying it should be on the president's side. It's hard to imagine the Senate actually taking charge in treaties today.
Yeah.
That seems like it would be a disaster and nothing would ever happen.
The baseline is, of course, royal authority under the British Constitution,
right,
which the monarch was able to make treaties with no involvement. Now, if the treaties involved raising revenue, levying taxes, all that sort of thing, then Parliament had to get involved if it involved some special parliamentary power, which is still the same thing now. Even if the president and the Senate make a treaty, you still can't levy new taxes without the House passing a bill to do it. And there's actually a question about whether a treaty could appropriate funds. Could you make a treaty that spends money and not need further congressional action? That's a real controversy, which we haven't actually
ever had to deal with.
Tested. No.
Yeah, but this does bring up something interesting, which is Hamilton's role in the convention in pulling us towards a more British-style government, just consistently trying to tie the executive to some of the powers of the monarch.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, there were serious proposals to have the Senate do this alone. There was never a serious proposal to just let the president make treaties with no legislative involvement.
Right.
So that's really interesting, where you have with other powers, there's discussion of sort of unilateral executive power for appointment to offices, for example, which we're going to discuss later this season. There's a real debate about whether the president should just be able to do that by himself without any kind of confirmation power in the Senate. With treaties, it seems like the real alternatives are either Senate alone or the president with the Senate.
Right. So now we've got to figure out, what does that actually mean in practice? What does that mean, advice and consent of the Senate? And Washington, obviously, is the first to have to try this out. So Washington is negotiating treaties with the Native American tribes. And he says, well, the Constitution says I've got to do it with the advice and consent of the Senate. And so poor Washington actually goes to the Senate to have like an in-person discussion about negotiating this treaty. And it goes very poorly.
Yeah, I think this is the only time that Washington sort of loses his cool in public as president. He winds up storming out of the Senate chamber because they're just bickering amongst themselves. He's asking for concrete advice about this diplomatic situation. And the Senate can't quit just sort of bickering.
And they won't even negotiate in front of him. They say, we have to do it in a closed door session, then we'll come back and talk to you. And he's like, well, why am I here?
Oh, yeah, there's
What's
confusion.
What's the point of this?
That's right, because the Constitution says the vice president shall be the president of the Senate, sort of preside over Senate deliberations, and then a senator can be appointed president pro tem when the vice president's not around. There's no provision for the president presiding over Congress in any way. So in a way, this was alarming to them because Washington sort of shows up and says, hi, I'm here to consult about this treaty negotiation. If I remember right, I mean, the whole episode is a little awkward because the Senate's not sure what to do with him. They finally sort of seat him at the front of the room. And the senators are sort of going, does this mean the president's sort of running Congress now?
Right. You can imagine poor George Washington, most famous man in the colonies, being completely rebuffed by the Senate and just feeling awkward. So he storms out and says, we're not doing that again. At the very most, I will send documentation telling them what I intend to do, and then they can say yes or no to it, which fast forward, we get to the Jay Treaty, and that's exactly what he does. So the Jay Treaty It's Chief Justice John Jay, which I think is very interesting. You're sending the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to negotiate. Can you imagine John Roberts being sent to negotiate with China today?
Yeah, he takes a leave from the Supreme Court. People forget there is a prohibition on members of Congress dual office holding. Mm-hmm. If you're a member of Congress, you're not allowed to serve in any other office of profit or trust in the United States.
Right.
But there's no such prohibition on dual office holding for judges. And so judges have actually been, this is the most prominent example, but judges have been employed in sort of temporary assignments serving other roles for the government. Congress has provided for judges doing this sort of thing from time to time, but Washington appoints Jay as the principal. Is he officially a commissioner? He's not appointed an ambassador.
No.
He's just sent as Washington's emissary to go negotiate. That causes some issues. Some of the Jeffersonians in Congress are unhappy about that. They think, the president and the Chief Justice of the United States are sort of in cahoots to go, bring about federalist foreign policy with the British.
And in fact, they kind of do. So John Jay negotiates this treaty, and then Washington sends it to the Senate for advice and consent, which at this point he understands as say yes or no. Mm-hmm. The Jeffersonian Republicans get all up in arms and say, wait a second, you never got our advice on how to negotiate the terms of this treaty. We didn't get to see how the sausage was made. We weren't involved in the process. And he basically says, oh, wait, I tried that. Mm-hmm. That doesn't work. All you get to do is say yes or no. You get to approve or disapprove before the treaty is ratified using, the mechanisms of the treaty. But you're not involved in that other process.
And constitutionally, that's not a wild position. That is, I don't think Washington is transgressing any kind of constitutional role for the Senate here, in part because the really interesting thing about the treaty power is that the treaty is called a law. In Article 6 in the Supremacy Clause, it says that the Constitution, laws made in pursuance of the Constitution, and treaties are the supreme law of the land. So a treaty is a kind of law. Legislatures make law. That would make you think the treaty power, the power to make a treaty, is a power of the legislative branch. But the Constitution, really interestingly, does not put the treaty power in Article 1 with Congress's powers or with the Senate's powers and then give the president a role. That's kind of how the veto works, right? Congress gets to make laws, then you involve the president in the lawmaking process by giving him a veto. If the treaty power was supposed to work that way, that is, it was primarily a power of the legislature in which the president was given some limited role, then presumably you would find it listed somewhere over there in Article 1, but that's not where it is. Instead, it's in Article 2, listed among the powers of the president. So it's the president's power to make treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate, and listed right in the same paragraph with the appointment power. The president nominates, and with the advice and consent shall appoint judges, Supreme and inferior courts, and executive officers, and all that sort of thing. So that's constitutionally, that really does put the president in the role of initiating treaty making.
In a way, this makes a lot of sense. If you're in kind of a Lockean framework, you're going to put the federative power in the executive branch. This makes a lot of sense, that power to deal with other countries. That's kind of at least half the point of having a president. But you're just allowing Congress to have some kind of check, some kind of say, in this case, the Senate. Okay, so the Jay Treaty is ultimately successful for Washington. He gets his way. He never has to be embarrassed again in the Senate. And this sets a precedent. This is how treaties are passed from here on out. Presidents send the treaty, and the Senate simply says yes or no. Then we get to Wilson and the League of Nations, and we have our first major treaty failure. And it's kind of the Senate biting back against unilateral presidential authority to set foreign policy. Let's put this in context. It's World War I. It's the Great War. We've been dragged into this completely worthless conflict in Europe, and we have got a treaty to end the war. And the Senate says no to the treaty, not because they don't want to end the war, but because it has, I think it's Article 10 in that treaty, would have brought us into the League of Nations. And one of the points of the League of Nations is basically a mutual defense pact. If one country is invaded, everyone is. And the Senate says, no, we are deeply uninterested in ever getting involved in European affairs like that again, or being compelled to. That would violate American sovereignty. And so Wilson faces serious opposition. But Wilson kind of did this to himself. He put himself in a losing position from the start.
Yeah, he's reaping the whirlwind. Members of the Senate had wanted to go with him to France.
Yeah, and the dominant Republican Party, including. Yeah.
That's right. And Wilson decided to go it alone. I mean, he just refused to involve Congress in a serious way, partly because it is the political opposition. He thinks he doesn't want Republicans involved in this. And they slap his hand whenever he gets back.
Well, and this also is deeply Wilsonian in the sense that Wilson has this idea of the modern presidency, that the president has the sole authority to speak for the United States abroad. He never has much respect for Congress as an independent institution. He's kind of annoyed by the idea that the president could ever be slowed down. So he thinks, I can negotiate this completely on my own, and kind of gives the middle finger to Henry Cabot Lodge, who's that famous Republican senator and chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Wrong person. Now, before this, members of the Senate had always been included in negotiations. But he just says, I can do it alone. And by the way, he kind of annoys everyone in this process, not just in the Senate, but European dignitaries as well, because he just goes on and on.
Our allies in Europe look at this as, don't make promises you can't deliver on. Wilson proceeds as though the president has just complete unilateral power and as though the Senate is simply going to concede or defer to whatever the president wants to do. And there's no good basis for that kind of assumption. It's interesting that when he gets back, he tries to make this a sort of popularity contest with the Senate.
Yeah.
You mentioned his view of the president as the representative of the people. And that's right. Wilson thinks, rightly in a way, the president is the only person in the government who's actually chosen by the entire country that can make any claim to representing all Americans.
Right.
And so he thinks, though, that should translate into sort of institutional power. But that's not how our Constitution works. Checks and balances means that even when you have primacy in an area, you still have to deal with the people who are in your sandbox.
Right.
So, I mean, the Constitution puts the Senate in the president's sandbox whenever it comes to the treaty power. And Wilson thinks the fact that he's a democratically elected representative of the whole country should be able to sort of counteract that constitutional structure. He pays a price for it. It's true that he tours the country trying to sort of, now we would think of this as kind of trying to drum up primary challenges or something against senators who oppose this, which is disastrous for him.
Well, and it's another test for him that the modern president is supposed to be this rhetorical giant who can convince the people that he reflects their views. It turns out he's a much better academic than he is actual politician. It utterly fails. And then he has a stroke, at least partly because of the stress after a speech in Pueblo, Colorado. Now you have dual opposition in the Senate. You've got Henry Cabot Lodge, who I think is kind of a funny character. He puts out 14 points that are wrong with the treaty with the League of Nations.
He was trolling Wilson hard.
Which is pretty funny.
That's right.
And then you've got these deep isolationists, like a senator from Idaho, who just don't like the world at all. Let's not get involved. And so Wilson is so offended by this 14-point second version of the
because
of the
Wilson
treaty.
had given a speech
Yes.
called the 14 Points,
Yes.
supporting the League of Nations and the treaty.
Right. And he says, well, there will be no compromise with Senator Lodge. And he instructs Democrats in the Senate not to vote for the revised version of the treaty. So the treaty dies, not once, but twice. It gets 2 votes in the Senate and dies both times. So this is a pretty epic failure for Wilson, not just as this idea that presidents can negotiate alone, but for his very theory of the modern presidency. He utterly fails to implement it here. So lessons are learned. In fact, the very next president, his successor, comes in and has a big negotiation for a series of treaties. And his first step is to involve members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. This is the same lesson that is learned by Truman and FDR when negotiating the entry into the United Nations, which is you need to involve a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. 1, because their egos need to be stroked a little bit, and 2, because that way they will help it sail through the Senate. So they learn a powerful lesson here, which is you have to involve the Senate. The Constitution requires it, and you will have your hand bitten off if you don't.
So I have a clarifying question. Now that we've entered the 20th century and we have treaties that involve mutual defense pacts.
Right.
Of course, after World War II, not just the United Nations, but NATO comes into existence. A mutual defense provision that is still immensely important for our foreign policy. When a treaty provides for a kind of mutual defense provision like that, you've got the president and 2/3 of the Senate committing the country basically to wage war on someone else's behalf if they're attacked in the future. How does that work with Congress's power to declare war later on? Are we just automatically at war?
What a good question. Well, that was the initial opposition to the League of Nations. That was the big one, is that this is a violation of American sovereignty because it cuts the House out. Basically, Congress doesn't get a say from here on out if Americans go to war or not. In some way, we haven't really tested this. Yeah. Is it automatic commitment to war?
I tend to think it's not, actually, because I think that the way that treaty obligations work is they are obligating the nation as a whole to do a thing. But the way that the United States goes about doing a thing, that could be going to war as part of a mutual defense agreement. It could be spending money that we've agreed to spend in a proposal, reducing carbon emissions. You could imagine all the sort of universe of things that it could be. The treaty obligates the nation as a whole to do that. But I think the procedure we follow to actually bring it about may require additional action. So if a treaty agrees that we'll tax carbon emissions, well, you can't levy a new tax, raise revenue, without involving Congress and specifically the House, because no bill for raising revenue can be introduced unless it's introduced first in the House, right? It has to originate in the House of Representatives. I think there's a question about appropriations, like if a treaty said you have to spend money. Technically, the Constitution says that no money will issue from the Treasury, but upon appropriation by law. So there's a question if a treaty says we agree we're going to pay X amount of money for something or spend money to do something. Maybe you could call that self-enforcing and the president could write the check out of the Treasury in fulfillment, because you could say that's an appropriation by law, even though it didn't pass both houses of Congress.
Treaty is law.
But I think when it comes to declaring war, entering a war that is not self-defense, that is, and we talked about the war power last in season 1. And when we talked there, we talked about the fact that you could have a situation where the president wakes up one day and we're at war. Somebody invades, right? In case of an invasion, we're at war. Congress doesn't have to declare war. The president can just wage war. But I don't think a mutual defense provision would trigger that kind of self-enforcing situation. That is, if Germany was invaded tomorrow by
the Russians.
A NATO country, would we be at war with Russia? I don't think so, because I think that you would still have to exercise the power to declare war. Now, you could argue we have a treaty obligation to declare war.
And treaty is law.
But Congress would still have to follow through and do that. In the same way that if a treaty obligated us to levy a tax, you'd still have to go get Congress to pass a law levying the tax. So I don't think mutual defense is a self-enforcing or self-executing treaty provision.
And yet they were deeply concerned that it was. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been the opposition. And I do think this would end up in the courts. Let's say Congress refused to declare war after Russia invades Germany or Poland, probably more likely. Can this go to the courts? And I think the courts would have to decide, is a treaty binding in terms of the war power? Yeah. Or does it require the House and the Senate to actually declare war? We've just never tested this before. This was kind of an unforeseen circumstance.
My fear is, given the current law of executive power regarding the commander-in-chief power, is that most people would conclude, sure, the president can go ahead and wage war as part of this treaty obligation. But I think that's basically wrong.
Well, it ignores the reality of the American system, which is why the very idea of mutual defense pacts are weird in the American system. And so much of America's interactions with the world are kind of weird because we act as if the president has unilateral authority on foreign affairs, and he doesn't.
You know what I don't know, and what I wish I had looked up before we started this conversation, is how these mutual defense provisions are precisely phrased. Are they phrased as if the other party is invaded or, what have you, that the United States is obligated to come to their defense? Because that would suggest we just have an obligation to do it, and then we'd have to follow the process to do it. Or is it in self-executing language? The United States shall come to their defense.
I don't know what Article 5 says. For NATO.
That's our homework. We're going to have to go look.
I'll have to go read it, the actual wording. But this brings us to the flip side of this, actually. Could a president unilaterally terminate a treaty such as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization? Could they leave NATO by themselves? And this is a very interesting question because we know the president needs Senate approval to join. Fine. Just like the president needs Senate approval for confirmations of his nominations. Fine. But a president can fire without Senate approval. So can a president also terminate a treaty without Senate approval?
If we're applying the rule of construction we apply to appointments, then yes, the president can walk away Usually. I think there's some limitations on that. One of those would be if Congress passed laws that were enacted into law enforcing the treaty, while the president might withdraw from the treaty itself, I don't think that does anything to displace any laws that Congress has passed.
Okay, well, let's
that have enforced the treaty.
Well, let's think about it like this. Congress has passed a law in the past couple of years preventing a president from unilaterally exiting NATO. But if it's a constitutional power of the president to do so, he could simply take this law to court and say this is a violation of executive branch authorities, right?
Yeah, I guess it's not the scenario I had in mind. Though I take the point is that Congress could, in a law, prohibit the president from withdrawing from a treaty. But I had more in mind something like, let's say we had a treaty for protecting migratory birds, which we do. There's a migratory bird treaty.
Oh, great.
And it requires the United States to ensure certain limits on the killing of migratory birds that move between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. This was actually a treaty that was litigated in the early 20th century. It was quite controversial. But if I'm not mistaken, Congress has passed laws on the basis of that treaty to enforce it.
Right.
To say, because we have this treaty obligation to Canada, you shall not kill these migratory birds, but under certain circumstances.
I see.
So while a president could go withdraw from the migratory bird treaty, the law that Congress passed to enforce that treaty and prohibit Americans imposing penalties on Americans for killing certain migratory birds would go nowhere.
Right.
So the president can get rid of the treaty, maybe, but you certainly can't rescind a law passed by Congress.
Right.
So I think it's technically true the president could withdraw from a treaty. But most treaties are not just treaties. They're actually a treaty that's then
enforced
by all sorts of laws.
Well, let's look at the precedent on this. So in the 19th century, presidents basically exclusively had congressional approval to exit treaties if they were going to do so. It's not until the 20th century that you get the beginning of this practice of unilateral withdrawal from a treaty. And the biggest example is Carter leaving a mutual defense agreement with Taiwan in 1979 in order to negotiate a new treaty with the People's Republic of China.
Yeah, this was very controversial because
desperately controversial.
Right. It's now official policy that we don't recognize Taiwan as an independent country. It sort of has the special status. But we did, before Carter withdrew from this treaty, not only recognize them as an independent country, as formally what Taiwan calls itself as the Republic of China.
Right.
We recognize them as the Republic of China, had a treaty obligation to them. And in order to establish diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, we think of as the country that is mainland China and run by the Chinese Communist Party. In order to enter diplomatic relations with them, we had to rescind any recognition of Taiwan.
Right. And this becomes deeply controversial for another very powerful senator, Senator Goldwater, who just is kind of playing the role of Henry Cabot Lodge here, but less successful. So Goldwater says, wait a second, if you need Senate approval to enter a treaty, you need it to exit a treaty. You don't get to set U.S. foreign policy by yourself. And that's what you're doing here by withdrawing from this treaty and recognition from Taiwan. You are setting U.S. foreign policy on a new path. He takes it to the courts in Goldwater versus Carter. And an appeals court says, yeah, you can't do that. And the Supreme Court steps in and says, dismiss the case. We're not giving any preference to either side. Dismiss the case. It's a political question. And just kind of steps away from it. So there's no answer from the court here, and Carter ultimately wins on this political question in that we withdraw from the treaty.
Yeah, this was one of those cases where the court issues a flurry of opinions. There are, 5 or 6 different opinions in the case.
2 concurring opinions.
But there's one per curiam opinion that says, like you say, case dismissed. This is not a question the courts can answer. It's not ripe for our decision because there's not a legal question that a court can answer here.
Right.
Instead, there's a political question. Then the justices all write separate opinions explaining why they think that's the case. Some of them suggesting, well, if things were a little different, we could step in. If Congress passed a formal resolution saying the president can't withdraw, we'd have a clear constitutional conflict between Congress as a body and the president, and then we could step in.
Right, which would happen if, in the case of a NATO withdrawal, for example, because of that new law passed.
Because then you'd have a collision between
the two
a
branches.
formal action by the whole Congress, because no individual congressman can speak for Congress.
Right.
The president can speak for the executive branch, but there's nobody in Congress who speaks for Congress. Right. Congress is a bicameral body that can only speak when it does something formally.
Right. One of 535 doesn't tell you anything.
Yeah.
But this is quite interesting because it basically is a non-answer from the courts. And if you were to ask a law professor today on treaties, can presidents unilaterally walk away because of the precedent Carter sent, you get a bunch of, well, maybe there's this case or that case, which I take as a legal professor telling me, I don't know. Yeah. We don't know. It's untested. So we would find this out. In the case of a NATO withdrawal, you would go to the Supreme Court because of that law passed by Congress. But even then, I don't know how it would come out.
Or maybe the court's right. Maybe it is a political question. Maybe it's the kind of collision between two branches of government over a shared power. Yeah. It's a place where the Constitution gives the Senate and the president a formal role. It doesn't answer all the questions. And maybe there's not a legal answer to that question.
Let the people decide.
It might be a matter of separation of powers, what we in other instances call departmentalism, right? Where the different departments each have a claim to power in the area. They duke it out. They each sort of stake out their ground and enter the contest, enter the lists to sort of fight it out. And then there's a political solution, which mainly means who wins the elections.
Yeah, I actually kind of like this answer sometimes. It's just let the people decide who they're going to validate in the end, the president or Congress.
I mean, in many cases, even when we think there's a legal resolution to a question, this is in fact how things get settled. That is, sometimes the courts think they can settle these kinds of conflicts between the branches, when in fact they're attempting to answer the question. Yeah. If everyone decides to go along and defer to them, then we get a legal resolution. If they don't, we keep fighting over it, then we get a political solution eventually.
Yeah, this goes back to my strong feeling that the court should stay out of more things and let things be decided politically. So more controversy is afoot, and that is on the difference between treaties and executive agreements. Executive agreements have become increasingly popular, especially in the 21st century. So some examples, the Iran nuclear deal, the Paris Climate Agreement. These are not treaties. The Senate never said yes to Obama on the Iran nuclear deal. They didn't even touch it. Instead, it's just an executive agreement. Now, the question is, what is the difference between an executive agreement and a treaty? And are executive agreements constitutional?
The short answer is yes, they're constitutional, but they can't do all the things treaties do. By definition, I don't think they can. I think anybody that takes a serious look at this would have to say constitutionally, an executive agreement can't be equivalent to a treaty. Otherwise, it would be tantamount to the framers having just let the president exercise the treaty power alone. Right. So there has to be a constitutional difference.
But what is
the question is how big it is. So here's, I think you can identify a set of executive agreements that are definitely constitutional. And that is when the president is in effect announcing that something that is within the discretion of the president and the executive branch as a whole shall or shall not be done. Mm-hmm. So the president says, basically saying, my administration will do this or will not do this. And the thing they're committing to do or not do is within the power of the president to do alone.
Okay.
Fine. That's just the president announcing a future intention, sort of announcing their intentions. And in that sense, it's internationally, it's just like an executive order internal to the executive branch, where the president says to a subordinate, I want you to exercise this discretion that you have constitutionally in a certain way. And they sort of announce to everybody ahead of time, this is how the executive branch is going to do its business. Mm-hmm. So it's just announcing that internationally with respect to other countries, the same way the president does with an executive order domestically. I think that's definitely fine. Of course, that also means any future president can just disregard or ignore it.
Right.
This is a commitment of that particular president to do it.
Right.
So that's definitely okay. Anytime we get past that and the president starts committing the United States to do other things that may not be within the president's sole discretion, now we've got a huge constitutional problem.
Potentially, for example, the Paris Climate Agreement, which commits to the U.S. to certain carbon emissions, et cetera, et cetera. But that would seem to require acts of Congress to fulfill. So is that executive agreement constitutional? Now, of course, it doesn't really matter because it's gone back and forth. Obama brought us in. Trump took us out. Biden brought us back in. Trump took us out. What one president can do with a pen, the next can undo with a pen. But the lines are very fuzzy between treaties and executive agreements. And we've never actually that I know of, had a court case on this or any kind of major public conversation. We haven't had a big public debate about it.
No, we've had the Supreme Court has said in the cases like I was talking about that executive agreements do have the force of law.
Yes.
But that's only when they're announcing the policy of the executive branch.
Right.
And then the courts can go, no, the president warned you this was the way he was going to enforce federal law and do all the things he can do. And that's legally binding. The courts can give effect to that. But that doesn't answer the question of a climate agreement.
Right, when it's fuzzy.
Normally require federal law.
To
implement, or a treaty that would involve Senate confirmation or Senate ratification. That's a totally unanswered question, I think.
And what's interesting on this is the Senate doesn't seem to be fighting back that much. So, for example, if you look at the Senate website, they have a page dedicated to treaties. The bottom of the page is a full paragraph on executive agreements, and basically it's they have the force of law. The Senate's really busy. This is a really useful way for the president to handle things without us having to get involved. It's kind of like it's kind of a rollover moment for the Senate. There's not any language in there about fighting back on what's a legitimate treaty and what's just an executive agreement.
Well, and we tend to think about what the Senate will accept or what federal courts will do. But the real question with executive agreements is, what do other countries think the president can do? If it's the case that these are generally honored and regarded as binding, and usually the president gets their way, then foreign countries are going to seek to enter into them and accept them as a stable way of making international law, basically, of making agreements. If the political system, if the sort of collection of, the courts and Congress and the whole output of the American political system is signaling that these are a very unstable way to make foreign policy, they're not a terribly reliable basis for making agreements, then I think foreign countries will get that message and that signal. I think now the impression is they have some force and effect, at least in some circumstances, but they're not treaties. So I think everybody understands at this point, if you really want a stable agreement with the United States, you need to go get a treaty, especially if it's going to do something in terms of prohibiting Americans from doing certain things, or requiring states or the federal government to do certain things. You probably are going to have to go get a treaty application. But executive agreements are an important part of the way the president does business. And insofar as they're just announcements of the president's intention to conduct the executive branch in a certain way for the foreseeable future, fine.
Right. And the point is, treaties are really, really hard. 2/3 of the Senate requires a good chunk of the other party to agree to something. So
it also might be the case that because a treaty can't easily be gotten rid of, and it may involve passing federal laws, there may actually be some things that are just temporary agreements or contingent agreements with foreign countries where you may not want something as permanent as a treaty. You may actually want something more
short-term, potentially flimsy.
Right.
So to recap on treaties, here's what we know about treaties. We know that the treaty power is found in Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, but the Senate is put into, as you say, the president's sandbox on this issue. We know that the president doesn't have to actively involve the Senate in negotiations, so it's usually smart to involve at least one senator in those negotiations. All the Senate has to do is approve yes or no by 2/3 vote. We also know that potentially presidents can withdraw from treaties unilaterally, though that's untested before the courts. We know there are such a thing as executive agreements. It's also kind of untested before the courts and in the court of American public opinion on what's a legitimate treaty and what's just an executive agreement. So I guess what we're saying is there's a lot we don't know, and much of it has to be solved politically moving forward.
Yeah, good luck.